Okay, hello, good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining. It's great to see some of you on here. As I said a minute ago, please do go through and ask as many questions as you can. Feel free to tap them in. They should come up on my screen. And anything that comes up, I'll do my very best to include or answer. My name's Dan Hughes. I work for Liquid Real Estate Innovation. And at Liquid, we spend most of our time looking at the future of the real estate market. And we spend our time looking at that at both a company and also at a market point of view. And then we help either the companies or the markets to solve those and to address them, either through products or developing strategies for the companies. And at the heart of almost everything that we see is in some shape or form data. And data is something that comes up in conversations an awful lot. But what I'd like to do today is not get into the detail of everything that does come up so much, but instead look at some of the high-level things that I think are often missed. So what I'd like to do is to look at three different questions. So start looking at what is data, where does it fit into real estate and the real estate processes, and then finally three questions that every real estate company should be able to answer. And just looking through the people who are attending at the moment, I think there's a real mixture of a few real estate and a few from the technology side. And some of this might seem fairly obvious, but I think that the real estate sector has a real need to understand data and the implications of it and what they should be doing with it. So I think these are things that are really important if you work in the real estate sector, or if you're in the technology sector serving the real estate. I think we all share a real need to be able to help educate people. As we'll go on to see, data works in a very different way and it behaves very differently from traditional assets and the things that we're used to. So I think there's a real education piece around data that the property sector needs to go through. And I think people working in technology really need to help. So before we get started, excuse me, I'm going to start with a quote. And at this point, I would normally ask people to shout out about what sort of data they thought this came up. Now I'm going to read through it, and I won't ask people to shout out because you'll be shouting into a quiet room. But what I would say is think about when this might have been written if you haven't come across it before. And so the quote says, valuation surveyors tend to say properties can never be marketed like other commodities because they're so diverse, precise comparisons cannot be made. But as a computer can deal with these problems quite simply, just as soon as possible, all the possible variables have been broken down into a code. The valuer will still be needed to interpret the vast amount of data that the computer can assemble. And so whilst I think that most of you would say that that is a relevant statement for now, and it's something that could have been said in relatively recent times, this was actually published in a journal called the Charter Surveyor, which is an RSCS publication. And it was written in 1977. And the point of this is really to say that data and the use of technology more generally in the property sector isn't new. It's something that's been around for a long, long time. And so it's worth thinking about why it's getting more popular and why the whole Proptech theme has come up. And a very large part of that is just because there is more data having a bigger interaction with everything that we do in live. And so data has always been there in the real estate sector. And one of the challenges for people in real estate is that talking about data isn't new. What is new is the breadth and depth and variety, the speed that it's been created. And that's where there's a huge education piece that needs to be done. So what is data? Well, put very simply, data is a collection of records or statistics that represent something else. And I think it's very easy to overthink what data is. People get very confused about it and go on some of the implications that we'll talk to in a bit. But at its very basic level, it isn't a thing, it's something that represents something else. And we can start looking at this as an example. So for example, if we look at the height of a building, which is something that feels like a relatively straightforward piece of data to have. And I've put an example up there of an estate agent who collected the data of a building 5 minutes ago. And within that, they've come up with it being 4.5 meters tall. So on the left-hand side, you've got the data. And then the following columns are the data that's about the data itself. It's also known as metadata. And we can see that that's a data point, but we can then create it in a slightly different way as well. So a different person can come along and they can measure it in a very different way using different technologies. And here, whilst I won't go through the full number, you can see there's a slightly different measurement It's on a slightly different scale, and it's much more accurate, but it was done a lot longer ago. And as we work our way through, we can start looking at different types of collection of the building height. So for example, different people, different qualifications. Here it's changed, so it's no longer looking at meters, but starting to look at the number of floors, which is also height, but very, very different. And as you go through, the final one here is that we can start looking at technology creating data for us. So what it can do, for example, is looking at 3D images, we can start extrapolating the height of the building. So the point of this slide is really to show that building height sounds like a very obvious data point to be able to measure, but it can mean different things to different people. And the left-hand column there is the data, but actually much more important than the data is the metadata, or the other columns which explain what there is there and what's going on. And once we understand that data is something that can be used in lots of different ways and created in lots of different ways, we can start looking at how that impacts how we use it in the real estate sector. So one of the biggest challenges for real estate is that the whole attraction of the sector is that it's tangible and it's probably going to be there tomorrow. Data isn't. So data is something that is live and can change very, very fast, and it's very difficult to grab. And we often apply tangible management techniques to data, which don't work. The second thing is it's not necessarily unique. So we saw in the example before, looking at the building heights, you can create, not only can you create copies of data sets very, very easily, which you can't do in buildings, you can also measure them in very different ways to give you pretty much the same answer. A huge amount of the real estate sector has always, and is particularly at the moment, debating about what data sets to share and what data sets to keep. Right now, that is not necessarily, the topic of data that should be thought about, because if it's already been shared or it could be created in an alternative way, there's no point in holding on to it. Finally, thirdly, quality is based on use. Buildings tend to be used for one use, and we try and rate it and decide how well it works and give it some sort of mark. But data can be used very, very differently for different purposes. So data that's poor quality for one decision might in fact be very good quality for a different. So it's very difficult to understand how good quality data is without understanding why you want to use it. And then finally, ownership of data is really, really important. Interestingly, I think that this is where the real estate sector is very good at managing the ownership of property. It puts security guards or security cameras or swipe cards onto an office. But when it comes to data, we should behave in exactly the same way, and we normally don't. So one of the really big challenges with data is that it's normally protected by ownership in some shape or form. So for example, in licensing, and as a real estate sector, we tend to then ignore that and use it as we want, because it's not quite as obvious as the ownership of a building. Going forward, ownership of data is going to become more and more important. So next I want to look at how data is starting to impact the real estate sector. And I'd like to look at this from two different angles. So firstly, looking at data within buildings. And if we look at a building, we collect data on it at the moment. And as you work your way around the life cycle that's on the screen, admittedly quite a simplistic one, you can see that we tend to work in a number of different silos. So going through from land to planning, design, construction, all the way through into operations and high-level asset management. And each one of those silos is quite a cliche. And underneath each one of those silos, we tend to collect data. Now, there is an argument that even within those silos, the data is very disparate and it's difficult to collect and combine. But all of the data sharing that happens tends to be at a silo-based level, based on the discipline, which tends to be based on the life cycle of the building. Going forward, data is going to become used more and more throughout the life cycle. So those data silos are going to become completely blurred. And that has a number of implications. So whilst a planner might not talk to a valuer of a building that's going to be valued in 20 years, the data that's created early on in the project is likely to be used further on. So skills of people who are out there is going to change over time. It's become more and more important to be able to at least understand data management skills and what data is. So whilst not everyone is going to have to be a data analyst, they are going to have to understand where data comes from to provide the advice that they need. And actually, if we look at buildings, one of the best examples of this move is BIM. So building information modeling is about having a data model for a building which stays with the building throughout the life cycle. So we've also mentioned about how it affects jobs. And I think that within real estate, you can split most jobs into 4 very basic tasks. So you can look at it as about collecting data, analysing data, putting it into some sort of shape or format to communicate, and then all of this is overlaid with an element of human judgment. And depending on what your role is, we'll have a different emphasis on all of those 4 boxes, but the majority of things will fit into that as a service to clients. And we can use that as a framework to start looking at the tools that are out there and how technology is being used. So in the past, for example, we might have used a camera or tape measure to collect data. Most calculations would have been done on paper or on someone's head, potentially a calculator. We as an industry do an awful lot of written reports, so we'll put it into a report format. And it's often said that we're a people business, so there will be advice and interaction, ethics, all of that is something that's the human skills put across all of that. And the framework that we can use starts looking at the future of technology. So we can start seeing where things fit into people's roles. So data, collecting data, is something that hardware and software and technology in general is incredibly good at. So all of the things, so things like a mobile phone, whether it be sensors, whether it be drones in a building, are collecting vast amounts of data on an ongoing basis. Now, for the property sector, that's fantastic news because we're not that good at collecting data. The problem is that we've now got so much data, we don't know what to do with it. And so this is where other technologies like machine learning or artificial intelligence or big data come in. So it's really using technology to make sense of the huge amount of data that we've got. And those 2 disciplines are very much data driven. It's what we haven't done so much in an industry, and it's what's growing. And if you look at the next one, communication, I don't believe this is necessarily about changing things. This is about enhancing experience. So it's about giving much more immersive experience. A good example would be in the past, you go onto or today you go on and look at photographs of property particulars if you're buying a property. In the future, you might look at a virtual reality model. It's pretty much the same thing. You're looking at a visual representation, but it's a much more immersive experience. And then finally, you've got the human skills at the end. If you look at how technology is changing, technology is really, really good at the first 2 bits. So collecting data and making sense of it. It's not so good at the human judgment. And so we can start looking at how data is going to start changing our roles as we go forward, because it's those tasks on the left-hand side of the screen, which we do at the moment, where technology will start competing and replacing people's roles. Of course, splitting everyone's role down into 4 separate tasks is enormously oversimplistic. And last year, RICS did a report which looked at around 45 different tasks within someone's job, within the job of a surveyor, and started looking at how susceptible it was to automation. And there are a couple of things to point out. Whilst I know you can't read the detail there, it's worth pointing out how much blue there is, which is how much jobs can be automated by technology that exists today. And then the red, which there's also quite a lot of, is how much can be automated by technology of tomorrow. In this case, it's looking around 10 years. It's also worth saying that there's an awful lot of grey on there as well. So there's an awful lot of people's tasks that simply won't be, at least in the near future, replaced by technology. So the challenge for us is to really understand where data plays a role and how that can be, how we can move tasks and focus on different tasks rather than trying to compete with the machinery. So the final thing I want to look at is to have a look at 3 questions that every company in real estate and probably every company should be able to answer. And just before I start going on to this, I do just want to remind you about questions. So far, I don't think there are any questions that have come up, so please do ask if you have any that are coming through. I can see a few of the names, and I know there are a few people there who'll be very happy to ask questions, so please do type them up and send them through. So the 3 questions that I think every company should be able to answer. The first one sounds very obvious, but it's what data do I have? And I think that there's been a great case study earlier in this year around GDPR. And whilst I don't want to go down a GDPR rabbit hole, it's absolutely clear that a lot of people didn't understand what data they had, where it was, and how they should be treating it. As data becomes more and more important to a business, more and more risky, and there's more and more regulation, it is going to become absolutely essential, if it already isn't, to understand exactly what data companies have in their systems. Part of the challenge is that a lot of companies are made up of small teams or organizations working under a common brand. And it's only in recent years we've started putting in a central infrastructure for data. But this is going to become one of the biggest issues that, that people can use going forward for their business. The second one, which sounds equally obvious, is what data do I need? So in the last few years, I've spoken to huge amounts of people who seem to be collecting data and they're not entirely sure why. Now, there is a logical reason for keeping data because it might become more useful in the future. But generally speaking, we can have a pretty good idea of what sort of data we need to run our business and what sort of data we're likely to need going forward. And so there are two very simple questions there. What data do I have and what data do I need, that I would encourage every company to think about? And it strikes me that most real estate companies don't really go through that thought process. Once you've done that, there's a third question, which is more to do with data strategy and business strategy. And this is coming down to why is it a competitive advantage? Why would you keep it if it isn't? So if data is a competitive advantage and you need it, you should be collecting it. But if it's something that other people can get from other places, so for example, if we looked at the building height data, lots of other people can replicate that data, it becomes a diminishing competitive advantage. So putting huge amounts of time and effort into collecting that data starts becoming counterproductive. So 3 questions I think every business should be able to answer immediately is: what data do they have? What do they need? And if it is a competitive advantage, can anyone else get it? So that's the very high level run through of those 3 questions which I wanted to cover. So what is data? Where does it fit into real estate, both the buildings and also into job roles? And then the 3 questions that every real estate company should ask themselves. From my point of view, some very simple questions about data and the use of it and how it fits into what you do as a business is absolutely imperative, can take very, very little time and effort and money to at least ask. And it surprises me how many companies talk about the importance of data and how few companies are asking themselves these questions. I think for the technology companies, especially those ones who are delivering data services, making sure we understand the wider concept and the fear that a lot of companies have, and making sure we help educate about why they should or shouldn't have data and how we can help them is incredibly important. So thank you very much indeed for listening. I think that takes us up to 20 past. What I'm going to do is just read this message that's come in from Ross. And whilst I'm reading it, please do also send in some other questions. So the question is effectively, will some of the bigger companies, absolutely agree. So what some of the companies like Google, Amazon are starting to move clearly from data hosting into other areas. And progressively they're getting more into things like house building. So looking at the house building, smart cities and so on, there are lots of examples that have come up in the last year or two. And I think the answer is that for me, data should never really, in fact, technology should never really be the answer to anything. So data is no more than an enabler to help you make better decisions. And for a real estate sector, it should be about how do we build affordable housing that works for everyone at a scale that works? How do we create offices that really help people to be productive and healthy in the office? And that's really what we should be focusing on as a sector. Now, to do that, technology is going to become more and more important, and we're going to have to use more and more data. So I think for the real estate sector, the incumbents are the best placed people to make those decisions because they understand that now, but they will have to use data more and more. If they don't, then there's no question that companies are going to come in who are good at data and be able to make better decisions because of that. So I think that there will be a blurring of all of those, and I think it's a great question. I think there's no question that some of those really big technology companies will have a bigger say in what we do, but I think most of them are looking to be a platform business rather than to do everything themselves. So where that goes, we will wait and see. So there's another question here that's come in. Could you please expand on the ownership of data will become more important? Will better controls in the handling and use of data also enable greater sharing of data? So I think that's two separate but very good questions. So in terms of ownership of data, if I create a data set and I have a business that's about creating that, then I own the intellectual property in that. And so if I then give it to you or sell it to you, you will then have to comply with my terms and conditions. From a property sector point of view, we tend to not always look at those as closely as perhaps we should, and so there may be restrictions on what you can do with it or who you can show it to or how you can share it. So I think that that's an area where we're going to have to focus much more. So actually, when I say it's going to become more important, I'm not sure that's true. I think it's always been important. What will happen is it's going to become higher up people's agenda, and it's going to become easier to start tracking when people are ignoring it. So I think that it's something that, whilst it's always been important, is going to become more and more important to companies going forward. In terms of the controls in handling and use of data, there's a real challenge for a sector that the more prescriptive, the more standardized you make things, the harder it is to share and to react fast and to be innovative. On the flip side, if nothing's standardized, then it's very difficult to share. So I think there's an awful lot of work being done by both a lot of technology groups and bodies, as well as the property sector, to start looking at this. I think the fear is for standards and regulation, and in particular where it comes to data sharing, is whether those bodies and those organisations are able to keep up with the market itself. So another question that's come in here is there anything happening on market at the moment to make the following data publicly available: rental levels, occupancy rates, cap rates? So I think that is going to be dependent on the country that you're based in. So there is certainly a lot of work being done in various different places around the world to look at how the data can be more accessible. So understanding how you can find data and how you can access it. There's a lot of work going on in all of those different aspects. Whether it's actually open data or not starts becoming a different debate, because that depends on commercial models and who's creating the data. So there are an awful lot of initiatives around the world to try and help companies with that. Some are software platforms looking to just consolidate and make it easier. Some are databases that are there to try and help collate data, or organisations I've been involved with in the past, such as IPD from an investment property database point of view, or BCIS looking at construction costs. They are out there at the moment, and there are new initiatives looking at those to make sharing data generally much more effective. Bobby Bryant, that's not so much a question, but very much appreciated. Thank you very much. And then the final question I've got at the moment is, are there any companies in the real estate industry you see leading the way with their use of data? And I think that's a really good question. It's probably an impossible one to answer. So I think that different teams and business units within companies are doing different things with data. So data has always been around and has always been used, and it's every company uses it in lots of different ways across the company. One company I would pick on, which is using it very well as an example, would be WeWork. So WeWork, I think, are doing an excellent job of focusing very much on the person they're trying to serve in the building. They're focused on developing what they think are great, and I think are great offices, but then working backwards to manage the data to make sure that they continuously improve and serve their customers the best. And for me, that's a perfect example of where data and technology should be used. So you start with the customer, you very much start on looking at what you want to be doing, but then you start using data to inform those a little bit more. So I think I've got through all of the questions. Thank you very much for sending those through. As long as no more come through in the next few seconds, I will say thank you very much indeed for joining me. I hope that was interesting. I can be found on email at dan@liquidre.com, and I'm also regularly on Twitter at property Dan H. So please do feel free to get in touch, drop me anything, any questions, And I wish everyone a very happy new year when we get there. Thank you very much indeed.
Dan, thank you much. Thank you very much on behalf of Global Proptech Online for your keynote today. I wish you a happy holidays as well. And thank you everyone for joining in today. I wish you all a happy new year and hope to see you soon.